Hi, everyone. This is Caroline Griffin. I'm the Events and Operations Manager for Riot. Thank you all for being here today. We are very excited to have Theresa Glenna with TUV SUD here with us today. TUV SUD has been a longtime sponsor of Riot, and we're especially thankful to have Theresa. She will be talking about understanding global market access. Just a couple of reminders for you guys. Everyone is automatically placed on mute to reduce the background noise. If you have any questions, please place those in the Q&A box, and we will get all of your questions answered at the end of the presentation. And this presentation will be recorded and put on Riot's YouTube channel, so that will be available, as well as a copy of the slides which Theresa has already graciously shared with us. So I'll make those available as well. But without further ado, I would like to introduce Theresa and let her take it away. Thanks for everyone for being here today.
Thanks so much, Carolyn. It's my pleasure to be here and to share some of our knowledge with the rest of the group here. I have participated in one of the meetings at Riot maybe 2 years ago, and that was really a great experience. So I'm glad to be able to participate in that again. I just wish it was in person, so maybe someday we'll get back to the in-person presentations. So again, just a little bit about me. I'm part of the TUV or TUV SUD Global Market Access Group. I've been with the company for more than 20 years and have over 15 years of experience in the global market access arena. So I have a lot of experience with different types of products as well, and IoT is certainly a hot topic right now, and this is an area where TUV SUD is also expanding. So just a brief introduction on the company. So we're a 150-year-old company. It's German-based. Our US headquarters is in Peabody, Massachusetts, which is just outside of Boston. We have over 1,000 locations worldwide and have lots of different services that we offer, from testing to auditing to quality assurance, factory inspections, certifications. And so there are a number of different things that we can offer so that we're a one-stop solution provider to get you to the markets that you want to sell in. TUV SUD started way back in the 1700s when the steam and power, water power generation was the Industrial Revolution. And the reason why we got started is because this new technology with steam power was causing boilers to explode, and they just weren't safe. So the German organizations that created these boilers put together a team to do inspections and to increase the safety. So that's generally where TUV SUD got its start. We were also there with the second revolution with production, assembly lines, and the addition of electricity. The third revolution in the 80s, where all things computer and automation were the new standard. And we're also well positioned to move into the fourth industrial revolution, which is the cyber and artificial intelligence. So we're very excited to move into this, and obviously IoT fits right into this fourth industrial revolution. I mentioned that we have over 1,000 locations worldwide. So here's a list of some of our locations. We're in over 50 countries. So we have the people on the ground in the places where you need them. This helps us to be able to offer the certification services from a global perspective. And with that, I'd like to move into our market access topic. So this is our Agenda for today, I'll just give you a brief introduction of global market access first. Then we will cover what things you need to do to start. We'll talk about next steps in planning with testing. We'll talk about how documentation is very important in the process. And for those of you that may already have existing testing done on your product, we can share with you some information about how you can leverage your existing test reports. And then finally, I'll give you some helpful tools to help you to stay up to date on changes in the market and how to get more information. So first of all, if you Google global market access, this is the definition that you get, and we abbreviate it as GMA. It's a process of managing compliance with regulations for manufacturers to gain access to global markets. Pretty simple, not quite so simple when you put it into practice. So these are some of the challenges that companies face when they're looking to expand their product into a global market. Starts with constant changes in regulations. Every country seems to have their own regulation, and those are increasing every day. We see new regulations coming out all the time. There's a lack of harmonized standards. So back when I first started, it seemed like countries were getting on the same page as far as accepting the European or the international standards, but not really the case. Countries have their own specific requirements that are in addition to the international standards, so that's a challenge. Also, it takes a long time to get through this, to get your product to market, and it costs a lot of money for compliance. SUD's Global Market Access team has many services to address those challenges. So first of all, we offer tailored solutions. And I'll talk about this in a couple of slides, but this helps to be able to provide a solution specifically for your product and your target market. And then we offer a full suite of testing. We offer factory inspections. Our inspectors are authorized by many international certification bodies to perform factory inspections on their behalf. So if you don't know, factory inspections are required for some types of approvals from some countries. And we have a global knowledge bank. So as a global company, TUV SUD also has a global GMA team, and they're the ones that help to maintain all of the latest information and keep us up to date on what's changing. And then finally, we interface with regulators, which are either government organizations or certification bodies, and sometimes also international test labs when in-country testing is required. One more note, if you have questions, feel free to put them into the chat, and if there's something that is relevant to the topic at hand, Caroline will interrupt me and ask the question. Otherwise, we will do our best to answer most questions at the end of the presentation. If there are any questions that are very product specific, we may need you to send us some information about the product, and then for those questions, we'll answer them after the presentation later on, after we have a chance to review the information. So now we'll get into where do we start? So the first question you may need to ask yourself is why do I need GMA, Global Market Access? So we've identified 3 different reasons why you might need global market access. The first one is the most common, and that is it is mandatory for you to be able to sell your product into a specific country. So most companies only are interested in mandatory approvals. However, sometimes it's market driven. So it may give you a competitive edge, even if an approval is not mandatory. Sometimes it's customer driven. So maybe you have no need to get a specific approval or certification, but your end customer wants you to get it for them. So these are some reasons why you might need GMA. The next questions you need to ask once you've determined that you do need GMA is, what certifications does my product need in order to be legally marketed into a particular country? And then related to that, who is the authority or the regulator for those certifications? And this is all dependent on your product characteristics. So normally when I'm standing in front of you, I'm holding a pointer to advance the slides in my hand. And so if you take that pointer or clicker, I call it, which advances the slides, and it also has a laser pointer. If you take that product and think about who the regulators are for that particular product, and just here in the US, we know that it is a wireless device. It has a wireless dongle that plugs into the USB port of my computer. And so wireless products are regulated by the FCC in the US. Most of you probably know that. And also, since I'm working right now, it's also used in the workplace and therefore could be also regulated by OSHA. So it may need an OSHA approval, or an approval by a lab or a certification body that's accredited by OSHA. And then if it was let's say if it was a medical device, so moving on from the laser pointer to something else, FDA is the regulator for medical devices. So depending on what your product is and does, you may have multiple regulators and therefore multiple certifications that are required for your product. And that's in just the US. So think about the same type of scenario. There are different authorities for different types of approvals in almost every country. So to manage all of this is really a huge task, and that's why companies look to TUV SUD in order to help them to manage and help them know what they need to do. One of the key aspects of determining what's required is your harmonized tariff code. I call this HS code or harmonized shipping code, HTS code, Schedule B number. It has a lot of different names, but essentially it's the same number that I'm talking about, same concept. So the real use of a harmonized tariff code is to determine the amount of tax that will be charged for a product when it's imported into a country. It has another use as well, and this is to determine if an approval is required or not. There are many countries that use tariff codes to determine if a product falls in scope or out of scope of that approval type. So we have an example here of an electric oven, and up at the top there is two boxes. One is the harmonized tariff code for domestic use, and then harmonized tariff code for industrial use over to the right. So you can see that these are different numbers. So if you have an electric oven that is for domestic use, some countries will require certification for it, but some may not require certification if it's for industrial use. So it's very important that you choose the proper tariff code. For tariff codes, the first 6 digits are harmonized globally, and then the last 2 to 4 digits are country specific. So we're interested in just those first 6 digits. And if you need help with this, I have some information or links that you can check out online for determining harmonized tariff code. But it's something that the manufacturer is responsible for determining. TUV SUD can't choose an HS code or a tariff code for you. You have to choose it. And if you need help with that, I would recommend talking to an attorney or your logistics company. So talking about planning for compliance, also the end use of a product is going to determine what needs to be done. So take this simple power adapter for an example. This is the same one that you would see attached to a computer, or it potentially could be attached to some other products as well, audio, video, medical, lots of different things could use an adapter like this. So depending if you have a medical use power supply or an office use power supply, we have to apply different product standards to that. So if I made this power supply, I would want to sell it in both markets, right? You want to sell it to IT companies, you want to sell it to medical companies. And in that case, you have to test to both standards. So this is also a very important thing to determine at the design phase is who is going to be using this product or what kind of environment is going to be used in. Another example is household versus industrial. We saw this with the slide with the HS code, Harmonized Tariff code. This is an example of a fan. This fan could be used in a household environment, or it could be used in an industrial environment. And some countries say it's a fan and we control fans. They're on the list of controlled products, so it requires approval no matter where you sell it. Where other countries say, no, we only are interested in household products. We're more about consumer product safety. So in those cases, they say, if it's industrial, it doesn't need approval, but if it's household, it does. So again, where is your end use application?
Teresa, we had a question on the harmonized tariff codes.
Okay, sure.
Are harmonized tariff codes in flux as markets become unstable, i.e., are they inventing new HS codes rapidly as trading increases and new supply reroutes? And who harmonized tariff codes?
Very good questions. I'll start with are they fluctuating? So harmonized tariff codes have been around for a long time. I don't know exactly who created them, but these are internationally agreed upon shipping codes. Might be Department of Trade, but it's why can't I think of it? WTO. But it might be the issue with tariff codes is that as brand new products are being invented, tariff codes aren't really being changed or updated. There aren't new codes being issued to address new products that have just been invented. So often companies that make new products are having a difficult time figuring out what is the proper tariff code to use for their product. But there are some general codes that can be used under each category that say, you know, it's drills down into other. So in those cases, it's you just have to choose the code that is the closest fit to your product. Does that make sense?
Great. Thank you so much, Teresa.
Yeah, you're welcome. Tariff codes in general are very stable though. And I foresee as new products like drones are a great example. Drones, there isn't a specific tariff code for drones because they didn't exist, you know, a few years ago. So they're probably going to come out with a tariff code that fits drones as an example. Okay, moving on to next steps in planning. So we often have companies come in with a new product that they've developed, and this is the traditional product compliance model that we've seen for years and years. So they come in, they have a new product, they want to do initial testing and compliance for a limited market. So I'm sure most of you in the room are going to say, yep, I want to launch my product first in the US and Canada, or maybe you want US, Canada, Europe, or maybe just Europe. So this is very typical. I mean, it makes sense. It's the biggest market for us here. But as you come in for new markets, so let's say you just start with US and Canada, and then you want to launch into Europe, the problem is that when we do testing, the testing is done at the US voltage and frequency and covering US requirements, and not necessarily the international requirements, so not necessarily Europe. The problem here is that you end up having to come back for additional testing. So the better way or new way of thinking is compliance planning. So instead of that traditional market, we start by asking you, what is your target market for the next 3 to 5 years? The reason we say 3 to 5 is because generally standards are going to be valid for around that amount of time. And so if we cover all of your markets for that range of time, then we can generally plan ahead enough for you to be able to use that data. But we develop a test plan specifically tailored for you, for your product, for your target markets. And from there, we do the testing for those target markets so that you come in for hopefully just one suite of testing, and then you can use that data for your full 3 to 5 year plan. The cost of testing is a little bit more because there are, more voltages that we have to run, and a few more standards. There might be variations to the standards, so we have to do some different configuration. However, it is maybe only 20 or 30% more than your just initial suite of testing, versus if you had to come back for full repeat testing later on, it would be double. So there's a significant cost savings by doing this. Lab choice is another consideration. So there are lots of labs out there, but depending on what your target market is, you want to make sure that your lab has accreditation for those countries. So this is an example of some lab accreditations. We have NRTL. NRTL means Nationally Recognized Testing Lab. This is the accreditation for OSHA for the US. Then the next one we have CBTL. This is, I'll talk about CB scheme in just a moment, but CBTL lab is one that can issue a CB scheme test report. CB schemes are the safety scheme, and actually they have an EMC scheme for international standards. Next one is Ilac. This is an accreditation that certain countries require. Brazil is one of those countries that requires the lab to have Ilac accreditation. Korea, they have a separate list where your lab has to be accredited by the Korean RRA, the Korean authority, in order to use their test reports. Same goes with Taiwan. The lab has to be specifically accredited by the country authority, and also South Africa. So TUV SUD labs have these accreditations, and so that's why we're able to test for global markets. The next thing to think about in your design phase is the component selection. So let's say you have a product that you want to sell internationally. Know that the components that you're using inside also need to have global or international approval. So if we go back to the power supply situation, let's say you make something that needs an AC adapter. So this is an example of an AC adapter. And if any of you have ever sourced an AC adapter, you know that one with all of these certification marks on it is quite a lot more expensive per part as compared to one with just, say, a CE mark and a UL listed mark or a North America mark. So there is some cost associated with this, but it's critical that your power supply have the approvals in the countries that you want to sell to. Because if it doesn't, you have to source a different power supply, and sometimes that means having to redo your testing because power supply is the most critical component. So anyway, this also goes for things like your power cord or your different components inside may also need to have different country approvals depending on what the components are. Next thing to factor in is the technologies that you're using. So if we take an example of a product like let's just say a regular old printer, and if you think about what safety or EMC approvals are required for a printer, China requires CCC, Brazil actually not required for a printer, but let's just work with the example. In Metro is the safety and EMC regulation in Brazil. Taiwan has BSMI, and then Mexico has NAM. So for our printer in Metro is not actually required, but the rest of these approvals are required for printers if this is your target market. And then what printer is sold now that doesn't have a wireless capability, right? So they have either Wi-Fi or Bluetooth function. So now, in addition to the safety and EMC approvals that you have above, you have to do the wireless approvals for the Bluetooth or Wi-Fi. And so China, you add SRRC to the list of requirements. Brazil has something called Anatel, which is the wireless approval type. Taiwan is NCC and Mexico is IFETEL. So you've effectively doubled the certification requirements for your product just by adding wireless technology in there. So this is something that has a huge impact on your compliance requirements and your plan.
So we have a question in regards to components.
Okay.
With respect to components, how many variants of your product do you need to test? For example, if you have 3 suppliers for a particular subcomponent, do you need to test assemblies with each of the 3, or can you just test one if the other 2 are equivalent?
That's an excellent question. Thank you for bringing that up. So it depends on the component. Most components, I would say, as long as they have the exact same ratings and the exact same approvals, you don't need to do any additional testing. But for a product or for a component like a power supply, this is a critical component. And so most of the time you do have to do additional testing for a power supply. So there are some cases where you wouldn't have to, but most of the time you would. Other components, not really though.
Thank you so much, Theresa. And another question here. Do companies ask you to compare the cost of engineering country-specific designs of their product to make it easier to produce designs that are easier approved and consumer accepted in a specific country or countries?
So TUV SUD does something called a design review, and we can do this from a testing perspective or from a global market access perspective. And we can evaluate and just look at what areas you may need to make some changes in. Not really doing a consultation, but more of just a review of the product against the requirements. So that is something that we can do, but I would say it's not something that is widely published. It's not something that you can really find information on ahead of time.
Very helpful. Thank you so much, Theresa.
You're welcome. Thanks for that question. So I mentioned a CB scheme. A CB scheme is an international agreement where there are member countries, and those countries have agreed on a single set of tests. And these tests are performed to international standards. So if you look at the standards, these are the IEC standards. There's a link below to the CB scheme website, so you could research more information about what this is. But essentially, if you have a CB scheme test report, you can submit that report to additional countries, and they would take that as a replacement for a full in-country testing. So it doesn't just allow you to march into any country, but it allows you to gain approval for additional countries without having to repeat the testing again for each and every country. So CB scheme also has something called national deviations. So this is an attachment to the test report, and it has the differences for countries, which are things like the voltage and frequency, and sometimes manual and labeling requirements, and sometimes additional testing. But these are the things that are different compared to the normal standard, where countries have said, we accept that standard, but we have these national differences that need to also be considered. So this slide shows the current list of CB scheme member countries. So keep in mind that in order to be a member country, each of these accepts at least one standard. So not all countries are accepting all standards for CB scheme, but this gives you a general idea. And I would say the most common standard is the Ite standard among all of these. But there are lots of different standards for different types of products. And ITE, I'm sorry, I use a lot of acronyms. It's pretty common in the industry, but information technology equipment is ITE. And then again, there's a link here to the member countries, so you can check out more about this. So the CB scheme is primarily a safety scheme. So I wanted to actually share with you some additional testing schemes so that you're aware of all of the different pieces that are in play here. So for safety, I mentioned the IT standard, ITE, Information Technology Equipment. So there's a brand new standard, well, fairly new standard that has come out. It's called 62368. And this standard is going to be mandatory for multimedia equipment, so IT and audio video equipment, as of the end of this year, December 20th of 2020. And it's replacing two previous standards. So this is the 6950. This is the old ITE standard, Information Technology Equipment. And then this one, 60065, was for audio video equipment. So these two standards, because so many products are incorporating both IT and audio video, they've combined the standards into this new one, 62368. So this is something to keep your eye on and pay attention to, because if you already have test reports to these standards, you would need to have them updated and comply with this new standard. The EN means European norm. The IEC is the international standard. Also, there's a UL 62368 for North America, or sorry, for the US, and a CSA C22.2 62368, which is the Canadian standard. So different countries have also issued their own standard, but these are all based on the IEC version. So we kind of speak in general terms and drop the beginning and just talk about the base standard. The other main requirement for most products is Electromagnetic Compatibility, EMC. And the typical standards for information technology equipment are CISPR 32 and CISPR 24. This is emissions and immunity standards. And then in addition, if you have a wireless product, there is an additional standard here. This is the 301489, which is the EMC aspects for a wireless product. So all of these would apply to IoT. And then the radio standards are additional to that. So there's 3 really different types of testing that needs to be performed if you have an IoT product with wireless radio. In addition to that, for Europe and several other countries, there's the RoHS requirements. This is restriction of hazardous substances. So things like lead and cadmium are restricted, and certain plastic chemicals. And then energy efficiency or standby for some products. And this is probably less so for the IT industry, but still could apply. So lots of different schemes to pay attention to. Next, we have documentation considerations. So this is something, if you're going to send your product for approval in additional countries or in any country really, documentation is a place where companies get delayed and tripped up. So the first point is that documentation has to match your company name, your company address, your model number, your product description needs to match across all of your documentation. So it needs to be the same on your test reports, on your product manuals or user guides, and on your labels, and on your shipping documentation when you ship it into a country. So model numbers, sometimes if you have a family, you might have X and Y variables in your model numbers. So some countries will allow X and Y variables to be listed on your certificate, but other countries require that you spell out all of the options and don't put these variables in. If you have a family, it's good for you to combine your test reports wherever possible, because some countries require that you have a separate certification for each set of test reports. So if you have, 2 family models that are on 2 separate reports, you have to have 2 separate certificates, where if they were on combined reports, then you could have 1 certificate covering both. So keep in mind that not all countries allow family models, but where they are allowed, combined reports are the key. Your company name and business license must match. So if you have a company name on your test report, it should match what's on your business license. I've actually had a product get rejected because the INC should have been incorporated, because that's what it said on the business license instead of INC. So pay attention to this. Some countries are very particular about it. Specifically, like Taiwan and China are very strict about this as well. If you have a product or are using different brand names to sell your product, those need to also be listed in your test reports. And finally, I want to talk about a regulatory model number. So this is on our next slide. So if you have a family of products, and let's say the only difference is one is red and one is blue. If you have 2 different model numbers, so let's say an example of your base model number here represented by 1, 2, 3, 4, and then dash red or dash blue, where X is red or blue. This is a situation, and those variables could mean other things besides color, as you can see here. If you change from individual model numbers for your red and blue product to a regulatory model number, it can reduce the number of approvals that are required, and it can greatly simplify your regulatory process. So there are some countries that only will allow one model per certificate. So if you have two model numbers, one red, one blue, that means that you have to have two separate certificates at 2 times the cost. So it really makes a big difference. So if you have a situation like this, my proposal is to drop the variables that mean things like color, software changes, but not related to your wireless radio, customer specific information, accessories that are included in the box, or other non-hardware changes. Then you can take just your base number, or whatever number you want, really. I'm using the base as an example, and drop those X's. So then your regulatory model number is just the 1, 2, 3, 4. You can, oh, and this 1, 2, 3, 4 number, or whatever it might be in your case, would be the prominent number that's on your product label. This is in your manual, and this is what you would use in your shipping documentation. Again, it can only be for non-hardware changes. If you have a hardware change, you do have to have a unique model number. But then you still keep your model number with the red and the blue, but just consider that your internal part number or your marketing model number or something other than regulatory. That way you can, know what the ordering number is for and know what to ship out to your customer, but still the hardware is the same no matter if the paint on the outside is red or blue. So again, I just need to stress that this is for non-hardware changes, and I know I've said that 3 times, but it's very important because if you have hardware changes, you have to have unique numbers. But this is just a way of simplifying things. I talked a little bit about labels. Sometimes you need to have warnings, and those warnings need to be translated. And also, your manual would need to be translated into an official language of the country that you are selling into. So it doesn't necessarily have to be your full, huge manual with troubleshooting guide and all that. It can be like a quick start guide or an abbreviated version of your manual. It still has to have some basic setup information and must include your safety warnings, but it doesn't have to be your full manual for the translation. And then also for families, make sure that you have a good definition of the model differences and documentation to support that information, because we use that to do family classification, which varies from country to country. If you already have existing test reports, some of the things that we look at when we are trying to determine if they can be used for your target market are these. So we make sure, is it to the latest standard? Does it have the national deviations for your target countries? Is the test data including the appropriate voltage and frequency for your target country? And the age of the test report. Some countries have different requirements for the age of test reports, but as a general rule, we try to make sure they're less than 3 years old. This is a guideline used by the IEC, the International Standards. And finally, for in-country testing, make sure that you have good test setup instructions. Make sure they're simple and easy to follow. Make sure that they include some pictures or illustrations. And actually, in this day and age, make a video, because nothing is more frustrating than trying to describe how to set up a product to someone who is, not able to understand because of language differences or whatever. A photo helps a ton. So we've seen great success with this. The test setup is one of the other reasons besides documentation that companies find themselves with problems or delays. Okay. Local representatives. So this means a representative is a company that's in the country that you are trying to sell into. And sometimes a certificate for a country must be issued to a local company. So you need a local representative. Sometimes those local representatives may need to be registered with the authority, or they might need to have certain licensing. And sometimes TUV SUD can provide this local rep service through agencies that we're aware of or entities that we're aware of, and they often charge a fee. Sometimes the local representative must be your actual importer or your distributor. So in those cases, we can't offer a local rep service. And the responsibility for a local rep varies from country to country. Some countries, it just needs to be a legal entity to hold the certificate and they have really no responsibility. And other countries, the local representative is legally responsible for the product in the country. So if it causes harm to a person, they're the ones that are held liable for it.
Theresa, we had a question about the video. How do you include video in the box? Do you place a QR code to a website?
That's a great question. Sorry, I was talking about if a product needs in-country testing. So you would ship your product with its normal accessories and documentation, but a video we would send to the lab, and we can send that by email or FTP or on a thumb drive or however you want. But that video is just for the compliance testing, not for every product that goes there. As far as test setup, if you wanted to send a video on how to set up your product, you could totally just put a link, a web link in the product documentation, and they could go there to watch a video. I didn't even think about that. I'm thinking about the evaluation and testing process.
Thanks so much, Theresa. Another question, how do most regulatory agencies today view hardware configurable devices that are similar to microcontroller program software, e.g. treat field programmable gate arrays hardware, or treat them as software with respect to compliance guidelines?
So if it's a firmware difference is what it's sounding like. This is evaluated on a more of a case-by-case basis and what that firmware or software is controlling, or if it's hardware, if it's a disk array or something, then it's either a hardware change or maybe it's just considered support equipment. So I think we should ask for some more information and more detail about the background of that question. So whoever asked that, if you could please get in touch and we could answer that after, that'd be great.
Great, thank you, Theresa.
Okay, now that we've covered the documentation considerations, now we're going to talk about leveraging existing test reports. So if you have a set of test reports, let's say you have a basic set of European test reports, or you have US, Canada, and Europe test reports, if you just add some other small component to that, meaning one of these other boxes, you have access to additional markets. And this is something that companies don't often recognize. So, and it means that you can obtain an approval for a country without additional or repeating the testing. So, well, some of these are actually testing, but it's only a small amount of testing. Some of these, like adding a factory inspection, are no testing at all. It's just having someone visit your production facility. So let's talk about this in a little bit more detail. So let's say you have your standard European test reports for CE marking. Obviously, that is good for the EU member countries. And also, there are several other countries that are not EU members that will accept that set of test reports without any additional testing. So Serbia and Moldova are two examples of that. There are lots of other countries. These are just for illustration, examples for you to think about. So we can submit just your European test reports to the authority in Serbia, and they will issue a certificate based on that information alone. Well, with a documentation package, but without any additional testing or anything. Same with Moldova. You need a Serbian manual for Serbia and a Russian manual for Moldova, but you know, it's a minimal effort in order to get approval for some new countries. This list of countries requires a factory inspection. So along with your test reports, if you have TUV SUD come in to do a factory inspection, we can use those two things to submit to the authorities for approval in these countries. So again, no repeating the testing, just adding an inspection. Or down here at the bottom section, instead of a factory inspection, it is more of a pre-shipment inspection or a shipment certificate. And Saudi Arabia is not actually an inspection anymore. They've gone away from that, but there's just one additional step in order to be able to sell into these additional countries. So this is just from a an EMC perspective, and we'll talk about the same kind of thing from a wireless perspective in a couple of slides. So building upon the last slide, if you have what I mentioned before, the CB report with the national deviations, and then EMC reports also with those national standards listed, then you expand into even more countries. And these here are the reason why we say, you know, make sure that you tell us your target markets, because we can test for all of those for just a small additional cost rather than coming back in for repeat testing. Japan requires a factory inspection for certain product types. So for this PSE Diamond certificate, they require factory inspections. This is mostly for higher risk products. Oops. And then some countries require the testing to be done to their national standards. So once again, you know, target markets upfront is what we need. And there are, again, lots more countries, but these are just examples for you to take a look at. So now from a wireless perspective, there are several countries that recognize US FCC marking, FCC approval. So if you want to sell your product without any additional approvals at all, if you have FCC on your product, you can sell to these. So this is great information to provide to your marketing team. They can sell into those countries without any additional cost for approvals or certifications. And then this second box is countries that recognize a CE mark, so your European test reports. Note that it has to be all applicable testing schemes. So we talked about safety, EMC, wireless, and so on. But these countries would accept just a CE mark without any additional certifications. And there are more. Again, this is an example for illustration. And but it's for specific Bluetooth and Wi-Fi or short range wireless transmitters. If you have a product that incorporates cellular or satellite equipment, then they may have additional license band requirements, so, or wireless licensing requirements. So that's something to keep in mind, that this is mostly for just short range devices. For that accept to FCC or European standards to apply for their national certification mark. So if you already have FCC test reports, or if you already have European test reports for your product, then can use those and not have to do any additional. We would submit those to the authority, and then they would grant their certificate approval based on those test reports. So quite a long list that don't require any additional testing. Requirements. So testing to national standards in the top block. The middle block is countries that require a sample for either testing or verification from a wireless perspective. And then again, exceptions to these rules are cellular, satellite, license band products. So lots of other countries in addition to these. Again, this is just for an example for illustration. And we're just about to wrap up here. We have our helpful tools. So first helpful tool I'd like to share with you is our TUV SUD Global Market Access webpage. Here, there's a link on the very last slide, by the way, to get to our webpage. But here we have a dynamic search function. So you can select one of maybe 30 different countries, common countries, and it gives you kind of a snapshot of what the requirements are for that country. And each of these bars here, you can click the arrow and you will get details about what the rules are, what the requirements are for electrical safety, energy efficiency, and so on. So this is super helpful to give you a high level view of what's required. Also, there are links to our Global Market Access ebook, which I'll talk about in a second, and our infographic. So this is our ebook looks like. We've created this document for 32 regions and countries. And so this has much more detailed information. There's a link to it here. The detailed information looks like this. This is just one page. This one covers Brazil for electrical safety. There's also a Brazil page like this for wireless. There's one for energy efficiency. There's one for medical. So there's several pages that are related to Brazil. It has the information about what their country voltage and frequency are. It has the manual requirements. So you need a Portuguese manual translation. It talks about what the regulations are. So it says in Metro here, this is the certification body, and it talks about what is needed for that. And then the next one here, the guidelines. So it tells you that the test reports need to be from a lab that has an accreditation, one of these that are listed here. I'm back in one of the slides. So that's where this one is coming from. And then at the bottom, it lists the product categories. So where our website was kind of generic, this one is very specific where it lists the product categories. So if your product falls in this list, then more than likely you need to get an approval for electrical safety in Metro on your product. If it doesn't fall under this list, then contact us and we can tell you for sure if it does or not. Last thing is we recommend that you sign up for our Essentials newsletter. This comes out quarterly, but for different product types. So actually it's monthly if you subscribe to all the different product types. But quarterly newsletter, and you can sign up for it here to stay up to date on the latest regulatory changes and updates as they come out. And I went too far. And so that pretty much wraps it up. So just as a reminder on how TUV SUD's GMA team can help you. First of all, we help you to understand the requirements for mandatory certification in each country. We help you to identify what certifications are required. We help you with considering the necessary documents that are needed for part of that process. We work with the regulatory agency or certification body on your behalf to obtain the approvals for you. And then it doesn't end after your certificate is issued. We then do follow-up on renewals and let you know of any changes that come up that may affect your product in the future. So really is a one-stop shop for compliance. And so that wraps up the material that I have for you today. If you have questions, you can contact me. This gma@tuvam.com is my team's email address. So either myself or one of our my GMA team members here in the US would help with any questions that you have. And also here's the link to our website. So at this point, I'd like to turn it back over to Caroline for any other questions that we might have and for a wrap up.
Thanks so much, Theresa. Great presentation. I do have a couple of questions here. Does TUV SUD provide a network for taking your product global? And does it place investments in companies going global?
Great question. So we are third-party lab, so we do not get into the business of finding partners for you to sell or distributors for you to sell your product. We have to stay impartial, and so therefore we're not involved in that part. And I forgot the second part of that question.
No worries, Theresa. I was just scrolling back down. The second part of the question, excuse me, I need to find it, was, does it place investments in companies going global?
So we do invest in companies, but generally they are our own test labs and certification bodies. So we have investments in, let's say an example, our Middle East team. We have expanded our certification body there, so we have accreditation to issue the national certificates for UAE and for Saudi Arabia as an example. So generally we don't invest in companies that are not affiliated with our core business.
Great, thank you, Theresa. Aside from mandatory regulatory tests, can you speak to the importance of a third party doing your company's performance testing? How critical is that, and how much does it vary by market?
So something we didn't really cover today is performance testing. This is really a different topic because I've been talking about safety, EMC, and wireless testing today, and these are mandatory regulatory tests. So from a performance testing perspective, this is not as highly regulated. So you have the option of doing your own performance test, and you have the option of asking a third party to do that testing. And it's really up to you and your target market and maybe your approach to the competitive marketplace to decide how best to do your performance testing. It's only in rare cases where performance affects safety that we would get involved, and it's mandatory to have a third party do that testing.
Great, thank you, Theresa. How does TUV SUD keep up with political forces on the markets through standards entry limitations?
That's a tough question. So we are following the guidelines of the WTO, World Trade Organization. And from a political climate, if there are serious issues with trade barrier, we can bring them to the WTO and they will open a case for them. But aside from that, we do our best to play nice in the sandbox, and we have local agencies on the ground or local branches of our company on the ground in many countries. So we're able to talk to them from a local perspective instead of a foreign perspective in many of those cases. So I think that helps a lot.
Great, thank you, Theresa. That is all the questions that I am seeing. If you have additional questions, I encourage you to reach out to Theresa directly, or you can reach out to me and I can help connect you. Thank you so much for being here today, Theresa. We really appreciate your time. Wonderful presentation. And just as a reminder, this presentation was recorded and will be released, as well as a copy of Theresa's slides. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Caroline, and to the Riot team, and I appreciate everyone's time and attendance today. Have a great day.